The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the general store, and Penelope Bradford tumbled out into the frigid January wind, wearing nothing but a thin cotton dress meant for summers back in Philadelphia. Her teeth chattering so violently she could barely form words as the driver tossed her single battered trunk onto the frozen ground without a second glance. She had expected California to be warm, had imagined sunshine and gentle breezes based on every story she had ever heard about the Golden West. But here in the northern mountains near Calistoga in 1885, winter had settled into the valleys with a vengeance that felt personal. Her fingers had gone numb hours ago, and now her feet were following suit, the worn leather of her boots doing nothing against the ice that had formed in the wagon bed during the journey from San Francisco. The trip had taken 3 miserable days instead of 2, because a wheel had broken on a rutted mountain road, forcing them to spend an extra night camped in the open while the driver and his partner made repairs. The main street of Calistoga stretched before her, a collection of wooden buildings that looked sturdy enough but foreign compared to the brick and stone structures of her hometown. Smoke curled from chimneys, promising warmth she desperately needed. A few townspeople hurried past, bundled in thick coats and scarves, barely sparing her a glance as they went about their business. She stood there shivering, scanning the unfamiliar faces for the man she had come to marry. A man she had never met, but who had sent her a single letter 3 months ago proposing marriage and promising a better life than the one she was leaving behind. Elijah Barnes had written that he was a rancher with land and cattle, that he needed a wife to help manage his household, and that he would provide for her in exchange for companionship and partnership. The letter had been stiff and formal, but it had arrived at a moment when Penelope had few other options. Her father had died the previous year, leaving debts that had consumed everything, and her mother had passed when she was just a girl. She had been working as a seamstress in a cramped boarding house, barely earning enough to pay for her tiny room and 1 meal a day. The advertisement she had answered through the matrimonial agency had seemed like providence, a door opening when all others had slammed shut. But now, standing in this frozen street in a town she did not know, waiting for a man whose face she could not picture, Penelope felt the first real stab of terror cut through the numbness. What if he did not come? What if he took one look at her bedraggled appearance and changed his mind? She had no money for a return ticket, no family to wire for help, no safety net whatsoever. "Miss Bradford," the voice came from behind her, deep and cautious. Penelope turned, her movements stiff from the cold, and found herself looking up at a tall man in his late 20s with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the edges beneath his worn Stetson. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with a strong jaw covered in a few days of stubble, and his eyes were a striking blue-green that seemed to assess everything about her in a single sweeping glance. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat, leather gloves, and boots that looked like they had walked 1,000 miles. "Yes," she managed through chattering teeth. "Are you Mr. Barnes?" "Elijah Barnes," he confirmed, pulling off his hat in a gesture of respect. His expression shifted from curiosity to concern as he took in her inadequate clothing and the way she was trembling. "Good Lord, woman, where is your coat?" "I do not have one," Penelope admitted, hating how small her voice sounded. "I thought California would be warmer." For a moment, Elijah just stared at her, and she could see him working through some internal calculation. Then he was moving, shrugging out of his sheepskin coat and stepping forward to drape it around her shoulders before she could protest. The garment was enormous on her frame, hanging nearly to her knees, but it still held the warmth of his body and smelled of leather and wood smoke, and something else she could not quite name. The relief was so immediate and overwhelming that tears pricked at her eyes. "We need to get you warm," Elijah said, his voice rough but not unkind. He wore only a flannel shirt now, though he seemed unbothered by the cold that had nearly killed her. "My wagon is just there. Come on." He picked up her trunk with one hand as though it weighed nothing and gestured for her to follow. Penelope did, her feet stumbling over the frozen ruts in the street. When they reached the wagon, Elijah set her trunk in the back, and then surprised her by lifting her by the waist and setting her on the bench seat as easily as he had lifted her belongings. He climbed up beside her and immediately pulled a thick wool blanket from behind the seat, adding it to the layers already wrapped around her. "Hold on," he said, and snapped the reins. The wagon rolled forward and Penelope clutched the blanket tighter, trying to absorb every bit of warmth she could. She was acutely aware of Elijah beside her, his presence solid and real in a way that made her earlier fears seem almost foolish. He had come for her. He had given her his coat. These were not the actions of a man who intended to turn her away. They rode in silence through the town, and then out along a road that climbed into rolling hills covered in brown winter grass and scattered oak trees. In the distance, mountains rose against the gray sky, their peaks dusted with snow. The landscape was beautiful in a stark, lonely way that was nothing like the crowded streets of Philadelphia. Everything here felt vast and open, as though the land stretched on forever. After about 20 minutes, Elijah pulled the wagon onto a narrow track that led to a ranch house nestled in a small valley. The house was built of wood with a stone chimney from which smoke was rising, and there were several outbuildings nearby, including a large barn and a stable. A split-rail fence enclosed a pasture where cattle grazed, their breath steaming in the cold air. Elijah brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down, then came around to help Penelope descend. She had warmed up enough during the ride that her legs were steadier now, though she still felt shaky and overwhelmed by everything that had happened in the past few hours. "Let me get the fire built up," Elijah said, guiding her toward the front door. "Then I will make you something hot to drink." The inside of the house was a single large room with a kitchen area on one side, a sitting area with a fireplace in the middle, and what looked like a bedroom partitioned off at the back. The furniture was simple but well made, and everything was surprisingly tidy for a bachelor's home. Elijah went immediately to the fireplace and began adding logs to the existing embers, coaxing the flames back to life with practiced efficiency. Penelope stood near the door, still wrapped in his coat and the blanket, unsure what to do with herself. She had imagined this moment countless times during the long journey west, but none of her imaginings had included freezing half to death or being bundled up like a child. "Sit down," Elijah said without looking at her, gesturing toward a chair near the fireplace. "No need to stand on ceremony." She moved to the chair and sank into it gratefully, holding her hands toward the growing flames. The heat felt like a physical presence, pushing back the cold that had settled deep into her bones. Elijah finished with the fire and then went to the kitchen area, where he filled a kettle with water from a pump and set it on the stove. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of living alone and taking care of himself. "I should have warned you about the weather," he said as he worked, his back to her. "I did not think about it. Everyone here knows January can be bitter cold, especially in the mountains, but I suppose you would not have had any way of knowing." "I am sorry for being so unprepared," Penelope said quietly. Elijah turned to look at her then, his expression unreadable. "You have nothing to apologize for. I am the one who should have made sure you had what you needed." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "The marriage certificate is ready to be signed whenever you are willing, but there is no rush. You have been through a lot today, and I do not expect you to make decisions while you are still frozen and exhausted." Penelope blinked at him, surprised by his directness. "I thought we would marry right away. That was the arrangement." "The arrangement was that you would come here and we would see if we suited each other," Elijah corrected gently. "I am not in the habit of forcing women into anything. If you need time to decide whether you want to go through with this, you can have it." There was something in his tone that made Penelope look at him more closely. He had turned back to the stove, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he was keeping his distance. It occurred to her that he was nervous too, that perhaps this situation was just as uncertain for him as it was for her. "Why did you send for a mail-order bride?" The question came out before she could stop it, and she immediately wished she could take it back. It was too personal, too direct. But Elijah did not seem offended. He pulled 2 mugs from a shelf and began spooning tea leaves into them. "Because I am tired of being alone," he said simply. "I have been working this ranch for 5 years, building it up from nothing, and it is a good life in many ways, but it is lonely. I go days sometimes without talking to another soul, and when I do go into town, I do not quite fit in with the other men. They have families, wives, children. I wanted that too, but there are not many unmarried women in these parts, and the ones who are here have no interest in a rancher who lives miles from anywhere." His honesty disarmed her. Penelope had expected someone gruff and demanding, or perhaps awkward and unable to speak about feelings at all. Instead, Elijah was laying out his reasons with a straightforwardness that she found oddly comforting. "I understand," she said. "I answered your advertisement because I needed security. My father died and left nothing but debts. I was working as a seamstress, but I could barely afford to live. I thought marriage to someone established would be better than slowly starving in a boarding house." Elijah nodded as he poured hot water over the tea leaves. "That is a fair reason." He brought the 2 mugs over and handed her one, then pulled up a chair for himself, sitting down a respectful distance away. "I appreciate you being honest about it. I do not need pretty words or pretending." Penelope wrapped her hands around the mug, savoring the warmth. The tea was strong and slightly bitter, but it was hot, and that was all that mattered. She took a tentative sip and then a longer one, feeling the liquid heat spread through her chest. "You do not have to pretend with me," Elijah continued, his blue-green eyes meeting hers steadily. "About anything. I would rather we be straightforward with each other from the start. If you are cold, say so. If you are unhappy, say so. If you want to leave, say so. I am not interested in playing games or trying to guess what you are thinking." The words hit something deep inside Penelope, some tightly wound knot of anxiety she had been carrying since she left Philadelphia. "You do not have to pretend with me," he had said, and suddenly she felt like she could breathe properly for the first time in months. She had been so afraid of disappointing this stranger, of not being what he expected, of having to perform some version of herself that would make him happy. But here he was, giving her permission to just be herself. "That is a relief," she admitted softly. "I have been terrified the entire journey that I would arrive and you would take one look at me and send me back." "Why would I do that?" Penelope glanced down at her worn dress, her chapped hands, her scuffed boots. "Because I am not much to look at, especially right now. Because I have no dowry, no connections, nothing to offer but myself. You came all the way across the country to marry a stranger and start a new life," Elijah said. "That takes more courage than most people ever show. As for looks, you are pretty enough, though that is not why I wanted a wife. I wanted a partner, someone to share this life with. Looks fade, but character does not." Penelope felt her cheeks warm, and not just from the fire and the tea. No one had ever spoken to her quite like this before, with such matter-of-fact sincerity. It was both unsettling and strangely wonderful. They sat in silence for a while, sipping their tea and listening to the fire crackle. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and whistling around the eaves of the house. Penelope was profoundly grateful to be inside, warm and safe, instead of still standing on that frozen street in town. "Tell me about the ranch," she said eventually, wanting to know more about the life she was considering stepping into. "What do you raise?" Elijah seemed pleased by the question. "Cattle mostly, a few horses." "I have about 200 head of cattle right now, and I am hoping to expand in the spring. The land here is good for grazing, and there is plenty of water from the creek that runs through the property. I also have a vegetable garden in the summer, and chickens for eggs and meat. It is not a large operation compared to some of the ranches further south, but it is mine, and it provides a decent living. You manage everything yourself. I have a hand who helps out, a young man named Thomas who lives in a cabin on the other side of the property. He takes care of a lot of the day-to-day work with the cattle. But yes, mostly I do everything myself. That is part of why I wanted a wife. Running a household and a ranch at the same time is more than one person can easily handle." Penelope nodded, understanding now what her role would be. She would be expected to cook and clean and manage the domestic side of things while Elijah handled the livestock and the land. It was a traditional arrangement, one she had expected, but hearing him lay it out so plainly helped her picture what her days would look like. "I can cook and sew and keep a house," she offered. "I am not afraid of hard work." "I did not think you were," Elijah said. "Anyone who would travel across the country for a new start is not afraid of hard work." He stood up and went to the kitchen area again, this time pulling out a skillet and some supplies. "You must be hungry. Let me make you something to eat." "I can help," Penelope said, starting to rise, but Elijah waved her back down. "Sit and warm up. There will be plenty of time for you to take over the cooking once you are settled. Right now, you need to rest." Penelope settled back into the chair, watching as Elijah moved around the kitchen with surprising competence. He sliced thick pieces of bread from a loaf, then fried eggs and bacon in the skillet. The smell made her stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. She could not remember the last time she had eaten a proper meal. The stagecoach stops had offered only stale bread and thin soup, and she had been too nervous to eat much anyway. When the food was ready, Elijah brought 2 plates to the small table near the kitchen and gestured for her to join him. Penelope stood, finally unwrapping herself from the coat and blanket, and crossed to the table. The heat from the fireplace had filled the room now, making it almost cozy despite the storm outside. The food was simple but delicious, and Penelope ate with an appetite that probably would have embarrassed her in other circumstances. But Elijah did not seem to mind. If anything, he looked satisfied to see her eating well. "The bedroom is through that door," he said, nodding toward the partitioned area at the back of the house. "You will sleep there. I will take the couch out here." Penelope paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. "We are not sharing the bedroom." "Not until we are married, and maybe not even then if you do not want to," Elijah said calmly. "Like I said, there is no rush. Take whatever time you need to be sure about this." It was the second time he had said something like that, and Penelope found herself both confused and intrigued by his attitude. Every story she had heard about mail-order brides involved men who were eager to marry immediately and claim their conjugal rights. Elijah seemed to be bending over backward to give her space and autonomy. "That is very considerate," she said carefully, "but I do not want to put you out of your own bed. I can sleep on the couch." "You will not," Elijah said firmly. "This is your home now, at least for as long as you choose to stay. The bedroom is yours. There was a finality in his tone that told her arguing would be pointless. Penelope finished her meal in silence, her mind spinning with thoughts and questions. She had come here expecting to marry a stranger and make the best of it, to fulfill her obligations and hope for kindness in return. But Elijah was offering her something different, something she had not known to hope for. He was offering her a choice. After they finished eating, Elijah brought her trunk in from the wagon and carried it to the bedroom for her. The room was small but clean, with a large bed covered in quilts, a dresser, and a washstand. A window looked out over the pasture, though now it showed only darkness and the occasional swirl of snow that had started to fall. "There is water in the pitcher if you want to wash up," Elijah said, "and extra blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed if you get cold. I will be right outside if you need anything." "Thank you," Penelope said, meaning it with her whole heart, "for everything, for the coat, for the food, for giving me time. You have been kinder than I had any right to expect." Elijah looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "You had every right to expect kindness," he said quietly. "You are a person, not property. I hope you will come to see that I mean what I say." Then he was gone, closing the door softly behind him and leaving Penelope alone in the quiet room. She stood there for a moment, processing everything that had happened, and then she moved to the window and looked out at the snow-covered landscape. The storm was intensifying, the wind driving the flakes sideways, and she shivered just thinking about how close she had come to spending the night exposed to that weather. But she was safe now, warm and fed and safe. And the man who had made that possible was sleeping on a couch in the next room, giving up his bed for a woman he had just met. Penelope did not quite know what to make of Elijah Barnes, but she was beginning to think that perhaps she had been very, very lucky in her choice of advertisement to answer. She opened her trunk and pulled out her nightgown, then washed her face and hands in the cold water from the pitcher. The bed was soft when she climbed into it, the quilts heavy and warm, and despite everything that had happened, despite the strangeness of her new surroundings, Penelope fell asleep almost immediately, lulled by the sound of the wind and the faint crackle of the fire in the next room. When she woke the next morning, pale winter sunlight was streaming through the window and she could hear movement in the main room. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure where she was, but then memory came flooding back and with it, a strange mixture of anxiety and anticipation. This was her first full day in her new life, whatever that life turned out to be. She dressed quickly in her warmest dress, which was still not very warm, and braided her blonde hair before emerging from the bedroom. Elijah was at the stove again, this time making coffee, and he looked up when she entered. "Good morning," he said. "I hope you slept well." "Very well, thank you," Penelope replied, and it was true. Despite everything, she had slept more soundly than she had in months. "I need to go check on the cattle this morning, make sure they all weathered the storm all right," Elijah said. "But I was thinking we should go into town this afternoon. You need a proper coat and some warmer clothes, and we can stop by the preacher's house if you have made a decision about the marriage." Penelope felt her heart rate pick up. "I have made a decision," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I would like to go through with it." "If you still want to." Elijah turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Are you certain? You have only been here one night. You do not have to rush." "I am certain," Penelope said, and she realized it was true. She had spent half the night thinking about it, weighing her options, and she kept coming back to the same conclusion. Elijah Barnes was offering her security, yes, but he was also offering her respect and kindness, and those were things she had rarely experienced in her life. She did not know if they would grow to love each other, but she thought they could at least build something honest and good. You have been nothing but generous and considerate. I think we can make this work." Something that might have been relief crossed Elijah's face. "All right then. We will go into town after lunch and take care of it." The morning passed in a strange kind of domestic quiet. Elijah left to tend to the animals, and Penelope used the time to explore the house and get a sense of her new domain. The kitchen was well stocked with basic supplies, though it could use a woman's touch in terms of organization. The main room was tidy but spare, lacking any decorative elements beyond the functional. The bedroom remained the coziest part of the house, and she found herself wondering what it would be like to share it with Elijah once they were married. The thought made her nervous but not frightened. There was something about Elijah that made her feel safe, even when contemplating the more intimate aspects of marriage. She suspected he would be as considerate in that arena as he had been in everything else. When Elijah returned, he was covered in snow and stamping his feet on the porch to clear his boots. "The cattle are fine," he reported. "A few of them found shelter in the trees, but none of them seem to be in distress. Thomas is going to keep an eye on them while we are gone." They ate a simple lunch of bread and cheese, and then Elijah hitched up the wagon again. This time, he insisted Penelope wear his coat as well as the blanket, and he put on a different coat that was slightly less warm but still adequate. The ride into town was easier in daylight, even with the snow on the ground, and Penelope found herself actually enjoying the scenery. The mountains were stunning in the winter sun, and the valley where Calistoga sat was picturesque in a rugged way. Their first stop was the general store, where Elijah insisted on buying her a proper winter coat, 2 wool dresses, several pairs of thick stockings, new boots, gloves, a scarf, and a hat. Penelope protested the expense, but Elijah was unmoved. "You are about to become my wife," he said. "It is my responsibility to make sure you are properly clothed. Besides, I cannot have you freezing to death on me. Who would cook my meals?" There was a hint of humor in his voice, and Penelope found herself smiling despite her embarrassment at being the object of such charity. The storekeeper, a round-faced woman named Mrs. Patterson, helped her try on various items and offered advice on what would wear best in the mountain weather. She also gave Penelope a knowing look that suggested she understood exactly what was happening. "You are the mail-order bride Elijah sent for," Mrs. Patterson said, not unkindly. "The whole town has been curious about you." "Word travels fast," Elijah observed dryly. "In a town this small, everything travels fast," Mrs. Patterson replied. She handed Penelope a beautiful wool coat in a deep green color. "Try this one. It will suit your coloring." The coat fit perfectly, and when Penelope caught sight of herself in the small mirror behind the counter, she barely recognized the woman looking back. In proper clothing, with her cheeks flushed from the warmth of the store and her eyes bright with cautious hope, she looked almost pretty. Elijah paid for everything without blinking, and then they walked down the street to the small white church where the preacher lived. Reverend Martin was a kind-faced older man who seemed pleased to see them. "Elijah Barnes, as I live and breathe," he said warmly, "and this must be Miss Bradford. Come in, come in. I have been expecting you." They followed him into a small parlor where his wife, a sweet-faced woman with gray hair, was waiting with tea and cookies. The Reverend explained that they would need 2 witnesses for the marriage certificate, and his wife volunteered immediately. A neighbor was fetched to serve as the second witness, and within 20 minutes, Penelope and Elijah were standing before the fireplace in the Reverend's parlor, repeating vows that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. "Do you, Penelope Bradford, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, Until death do you part." "I do," Penelope said, her voice steady. "And do you, Elijah Barnes, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Elijah said, and his voice was firm and sure. "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride." Elijah leaned down and pressed a brief, chaste kiss to Penelope's lips. It was over in a second, barely more than a brushing of mouths, but Penelope felt the touch all the way to her toes. Then the reverend's wife was hugging her and congratulating them both, and the neighbor was pumping Elijah's hand, and somehow it was done. She was married. They signed the certificate, and the reverend promised to file it with the county clerk. Then they were walking back out into the cold afternoon, husband and wife, returning to the wagon that would take them to the ranch that was now Penelope's home. The ride back was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. Penelope kept sneaking glances at Elijah, trying to reconcile the fact that this man was now her husband. He had shaved that morning, she noticed, and his hair had been neatly combed. He had made an effort for their wedding, even though it had been a simple civil ceremony with no flowers or music or celebration. When they reached the ranch, Elijah helped her down from the wagon and carried all her new purchases inside. The house felt different now, warmer somehow, more like a real home. Penelope busied herself putting away her new clothes and organizing the kitchen while Elijah went out to do the evening chores. When he came back in, the sun was setting and the house was filled with the smell of the stew Penelope had started on the stove. She had found potatoes and carrots and some salted beef in the pantry, and she had done her best to make something hearty and filling. Elijah stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking around, and then he met her eyes. "This is nice," he said simply, "having someone here, having you here." Penelope felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spread through her chest. "I am glad to be here," she said, and meant it. They ate dinner together at the small table, talking about mundane things like the ranch and the weather and what supplies they would need to get through the rest of the winter. It felt surprisingly natural, this easy back and forth conversation, as though they had known each other much longer than 2 days. When the meal was finished and the dishes were washed, they sat together near the fire, and Elijah pulled out a worn book of poetry. "I like to read in the evenings," he explained, sounding almost self-conscious. "It is something I started doing to pass the time. I can do it quietly if you would rather have silence." "I would love to hear you read," Penelope said honestly. She had always enjoyed literature, but had rarely had access to books in recent years. So Elijah read to her, his deep voice turning the words into something almost musical, and Penelope sat curled up in her chair, listening and watching the firelight play across his features. He was a handsome man, she thought, but more than that, he was a good man. She could see it in the way he handled everything. From the gentleness with which he had treated her from the moment they met to the care he took with his animals to the quiet pleasure he found in something as simple as reading poetry. When it grew late, they both stood, and there was a moment of awkwardness as they faced the question that had been hovering between them all evening. "The bedroom is still yours if you want it," Elijah said. "Nothing has to change just because we signed a piece of paper." Penelope considered this. Part of her was relieved by the offer, grateful for more time to adjust. But another part of her, a braver part, wanted to take the next step. They were married now, and she did not want to spend her wedding night alone. "I think," she said carefully, "that we are married now, and married people share a bed if you are willing." Elijah's eyes searched hers. "Are you sure? There is no pressure, Penelope. We can take this as slow as you need." "I am sure," she said, and she was. She trusted him in a way she had not expected to trust anyone ever again. They went into the bedroom together, and Elijah lit the lamp on the dresser while Penelope changed into her nightgown behind a screen in the corner. When she emerged, Elijah had removed his shirt and boots, but was still wearing his trousers. He looked uncertain, almost vulnerable in a way that made Penelope realize he was just as nervous as she was. They climbed into the bed from opposite sides, and for a moment they just lay there, stiff and awkward. Then Elijah turned on his side to face her. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that I will never force you to do anything you do not want to do. This marriage is a partnership, and that includes this part of it." Penelope reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I know," she said, "and I appreciate that more than I can say, but I am not afraid, not of you." What followed was gentle and awkward and sweet in equal measure. Elijah was patient and careful, and Penelope found that while there was some discomfort, there was also an unexpected tenderness that made her feel cherished in a way she never had before. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Elijah's arm around her waist and her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow and steady beneath her ear. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "I am more than all right," Penelope whispered. "I am happy." She felt him press a kiss to the top of her head, and then they drifted off to sleep together. Two people who had been strangers just days ago but were now bound together by vows and by choice, and by the beginning of something that might, in time, become love. The next weeks passed in a rhythm that Penelope found both challenging and deeply satisfying. She rose each morning before dawn to make breakfast for Elijah, and then she spent her days cleaning and cooking and learning the ins and outs of ranch life. She had never lived on a ranch before, and there was much to learn. Elijah was patient with her questions, teaching her about the cattle and the land and the seasonal rhythms that governed everything they did. She met Thomas, the ranch hand, a shy young man of about 20 who turned bright red whenever she spoke to him. He lived in a small cabin on the far side of the property and took his meals with them several times a week. Penelope liked him immediately. He was hardworking and earnest, and he clearly respected Elijah a great deal. The weather remained cold and unpredictable, with several more snowstorms sweeping through the valley. But Penelope no longer felt afraid of the cold. She had warm clothes and a warm house and a husband who made sure she was taken care of. And as the days turned into weeks, she found herself growing genuinely fond of Elijah. He was a man of few words, but the words he did speak were always thoughtful and sincere. He had a quiet sense of humor that caught her off guard sometimes, making her laugh with unexpected observations or dry comments. He worked hard but never complained, and he treated her with a respect and consideration that she had never experienced in any relationship before. And at night, when they lay together in the darkness, Penelope found herself opening up to him in ways she had never opened up to anyone. She told him about her childhood, about her mother's death, and her father's slow descent into gambling and debt. She told him about the years of fear and uncertainty, about working her fingers raw at the sewing machine to earn pennies. And Elijah listened, really listened, and then he shared his own stories. He had grown up on a ranch in Texas, he told her, the youngest of 4 brothers. His parents had died in a fever epidemic when he was 17, and his older brothers had divided up the family ranch among themselves. There had been no place for Elijah, no inheritance left for the youngest son, so he had struck out on his own. He had worked as a ranch hand for several years, saving every penny, and then he had come to California and bought this land with everything he had. He had built the house and the barn with his own hands, had started with just a dozen head of cattle and grown the herd slowly and carefully. "It is not much," he said one night, his voice rough in the darkness. "But it is mine. I never wanted to be rich. I just wanted to have something that belonged to me, something I could build and be proud of." "It is more than I ever dreamed of having," Penelope said honestly. "You have built something good here, Elijah. Something real." She felt him pull her closer, and she rested her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. In these quiet moments, she thought she could feel something growing between them, something deeper than mere partnership or convenience. She was not sure she would call it love yet, but it was the beginning of love, a foundation being laid one small moment at a time. February arrived with slightly warmer temperatures, and the snow began to melt, turning the roads into muddy streams. Elijah took Penelope into town one Saturday for supplies, and Mrs. Patterson at the general store greeted her like an old friend. "Marriage is suiting you," the older woman observed, looking Penelope up and down with approval. "You have color in your cheeks now and meat on your bones. Elijah is taking good care of you." "He is," Penelope agreed, feeling a rush of affection for her taciturn husband who was currently loading bags of flour into the wagon outside. "The church is having a social next month," Mrs. Patterson continued. "A dance to celebrate the end of winter. You two should come. It would be good for folks to get to know you properly." Penelope promised to discuss it with Elijah, and when she mentioned it to him on the ride home, he surprised her by agreeing immediately. "I am not much of a dancer," he admitted. "But it would be nice to show you off a bit. Let everyone see what a lucky man I am." The compliment, delivered in his matter-of-fact way, made Penelope's heart skip a beat. Elijah was not given to flowery speeches or grand romantic gestures, but when he said something, he meant it, and that made his words all the more precious. The weeks leading up to the dance were busy ones. Spring was beginning to make itself felt, and there was work to be done preparing for the calving season. Elijah spent long hours out with the herd, and Penelope found herself helping more and more with the outdoor work. She learned to mend fences and tend to the chickens, and even help deliver a calf when one of the cows had trouble. She would never forget standing in the cold barn at midnight, her arms deep in straw and blood, watching as Elijah carefully helped the struggling cow bring her calf into the world. When the little creature finally emerged, wet and wobbly but alive, Elijah looked at Penelope with such joy and triumph that she felt tears spring to her eyes. "We did it," he said, grinning at her, and in that moment Penelope realized with startling clarity that she loved him. It was not the overwhelming passion of the romance novels she had occasionally read, not the lightning strike of love at first sight. It was something quieter and deeper, built on shared work and mutual respect and countless small kindnesses. But it was real, and it was strong, and it filled her whole heart until she thought she might burst with it. She did not tell him that night. The moment did not seem right, standing there covered in barn muck and exhausted from hours of labor. But she held the knowledge close, turning it over in her mind like a precious jewel, and she promised herself she would find the right time to say the words. The night of the church social arrived with unseasonably warm weather, as though spring had decided to announce itself early. Penelope wore one of her new wool dresses, this one a soft blue color that Elijah had said matched her eyes, and she braided her hair into a crown around her head. Elijah put on a clean shirt and polished his boots, and together they made the journey into town. The church hall was full of people when they arrived, and Penelope felt a moment of nervousness. She had been so focused on adjusting to ranch life that she had not given much thought to integrating into the community. But Mrs. Patterson swept down on them immediately, pulling Penelope into the crowd and making introductions left and right. There was the doctor, a kind elderly man named Dr. Whitmore, and his wife. There was the school teacher, Miss Sarah Keene, a young woman not much older than Penelope herself. There was the blacksmith and his family, the banker and his wife, the owners of the hotel, and what seemed like dozens of others. Everyone was friendly and welcoming, and Penelope found herself relaxing as the evening wore on. When the music started, Elijah took her hand and led her onto the dance floor. He had not been lying about his dancing skills. He was stiff and awkward, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but Penelope did not care. She loved the feeling of his hand on her waist, the solid strength of him as they moved together, the way he looked at her as though she were the only person in the room. They danced 3 dances before Elijah begged off, claiming he needed air, and Penelope followed him outside. The night was clear and cool, and the stars were brilliant overhead, more stars than Penelope had ever seen in the city. "Are you having a good time?" Elijah asked, looking down at her with concern. "I know this is not very exciting compared to what you must be used to in Philadelphia." "Philadelphia was never exciting," Penelope said. "It was crowded and dirty and lonely. This is better. This is so much better." Elijah smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his whole face, and Penelope knew this was the moment. This was when she needed to tell him. "Elijah," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I need to tell you something." His smile faded, replaced by concern. "What is it? Are you unhappy? Do you want to leave?" "No," Penelope said quickly. "No, nothing like that. I just need you to know that I love you." I do not know when it happened exactly, but somewhere between freezing on the street in Calistoga and tonight, I fell in love with you, and I wanted you to know. For a long moment, Elijah just stared at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light from the church hall. Then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I love you too," he said roughly, his voice thick with emotion. "I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you standing there shivering in that thin dress, looking so brave and scared all at once. I have been trying not to hope too much, trying not to assume you would ever feel the same way about me. But God, Penelope, I love you so much it scares me sometimes." Penelope wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him, pouring everything she felt into the gesture. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless and laughing, and Elijah rested his forehead against hers. "Let's go home," he whispered. "I want to be alone with my wife." They made their excuses to Mrs. Patterson and slipped out into the night, and the ride home seemed to take forever, even though it was the same distance it had always been. When they finally reached the ranch, Elijah helped Penelope down from the wagon and then swept her up into his arms, carrying her across the threshold like a proper bride. Inside, with the door closed against the night and the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls, they came together with a passion that had been building for weeks. This time there was no awkwardness, no uncertainty. They knew each other now, knew what brought pleasure and what brought closeness, and they loved each other with the full knowledge of that love between them. Afterward, lying tangled together in their bed, Penelope felt a contentment so complete it was almost frightening. She had not known before coming here that life could feel like this, that she could feel this safe, this cherished, this wholly and completely loved. "I'm so glad I answered your advertisement," she whispered into the darkness. "I am so glad you showed up freezing and wearing that ridiculous thin dress," Elijah replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Because otherwise I might never have had the chance to fall in love with you." Spring arrived in earnest over the following weeks, bringing with it longer days and warmer temperatures. The cattle grew fat on the new grass, and the calves born over the winter frolicked in the pastures. Penelope planted a vegetable garden behind the house, setting out seeds for tomatoes and beans and squash, dreaming of fresh produce for their table. She had fully embraced ranch life now, working alongside Elijah whenever he needed help in managing the household with growing confidence. The house itself had transformed under her care, becoming a true home with curtains on the windows and wildflowers on the table, and the smell of fresh bread wafting from the kitchen. Thomas had become a regular fixture at their dinner table, and Penelope enjoyed the young man's company. He reminded her a bit of what a younger brother might be like, earnest and hardworking and eager to please. He clearly admired Elijah and was polite to Penelope in a way that suggested he saw her as something like a sister. One evening in late April, after Thomas had gone back to his cabin and Penelope was washing the dishes, Elijah came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "I have been thinking," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "This ranch could support a larger herd than we have now. I have been saving money, and I think next year we could expand significantly. Maybe hire another hand or two, build a bigger barn." "That sounds wonderful," Penelope said, leaning back against him. "You have worked so hard for this. You deserve to see it grow." "We have worked hard for this," Elijah corrected gently. "You are just as much a part of this ranch as I am now. Whatever we build together." Penelope turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "I love you," she said, and the words came easily now, no longer frightening or uncertain. "I love you too," Elijah replied and kissed her softly. They were standing like that, wrapped in each other's arms, when Penelope felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She swayed slightly, and Elijah immediately tightened his grip. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern sharp in his voice. "I am fine," Penelope said, but even as she spoke, she realized she had been feeling tired and slightly ill for the past week. She had attributed it to working hard in the garden, but now, thinking about it more carefully, she remembered that her monthly courses had not come when they were supposed to. The realization hit her like a thunderbolt, and she looked up at Elijah with wide eyes. "I think," she said slowly, hardly daring to hope, "that I might be with child." Elijah went very still, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" "Not completely sure," Penelope admitted. "But I am late and I have been feeling strange. We should probably have Dr. Whitmore examine me to be certain." A grin split Elijah's face, so wide and joyful that it made him look years younger. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby." He picked her up and spun her around, making her laugh and clutch at his shoulders. Then he set her down carefully, as though she were made of glass. "Are you feeling all right? Do you need to sit down? Should I get you some water?" "I am fine," Penelope said, laughing at his sudden protectiveness. "Women have babies all the time, Elijah. I am not fragile." "But you are precious," Elijah said seriously. "And if you are carrying our child, then you are even more precious. I will not take any chances with either of you." They went into town the next day to see Dr. Whitmore, who confirmed what Penelope had suspected. She was indeed expecting a child, likely due to arrive in late November or early December if his calculations were correct. Elijah was practically walking on air as they left the doctor's office, and he insisted on stopping at the general store to buy yarn so Penelope could start knitting baby clothes. Mrs. Patterson clucked over the news like a mother hen, offering advice and predictions about whether it would be a boy or a girl. The months that followed were some of the happiest of Penelope's life. Her belly grew round with the baby, and Elijah was endlessly fascinated by every change in her body. He would lie with his head on her stomach at night, talking to the baby and feeling for kicks. When the baby finally did start moving, around the end of July, Elijah was so excited he ran out to tell Thomas, who came back to the house grinning and offering his congratulations. The work of the ranch continued around them. The cattle were rounded up and the calves were branded, and Elijah began negotiations to buy additional land from a neighboring rancher who was looking to sell. Penelope continued to manage the household, though Elijah insisted she rest more as her pregnancy progressed. The vegetable garden flourished, providing them with fresh produce throughout the summer and into the fall. Penelope spent hours preserving vegetables and making jam, stocking the pantry for the winter to come. She knitted constantly, creating a small wardrobe of tiny garments and soft blankets for the baby. They discussed names endlessly. Elijah wanted to name a boy after his father, whose name had been Emmett, and Penelope liked the name Pearl for a girl, after her mother. But they agreed they would wait until the baby was born to make a final decision. November arrived with its usual cold winds and gray skies, and Penelope found herself growing more uncomfortable as the baby grew larger. She could no longer help with the outdoor work, and even simple tasks like cooking and cleaning left her exhausted. Elijah had brought Mrs. Patterson out to the ranch to stay with them as Penelope's time drew near, and the older woman proved to be a blessing, taking over most of the household duties and providing reassurance when Penelope grew anxious about the impending birth. The baby came on a cold, clear night in early December, 2 weeks earlier than Dr. Whitmore had predicted. Penelope's pain started just after dinner, and within an hour they were coming fast and hard. Elijah rode into town through the darkness to fetch the doctor while Mrs. Patterson stayed with Penelope, coaching her through the contractions and preparing everything they would need. By the time Elijah returned with Dr. Whitmore, Penelope was deep in the throes of labor, and all she could do was grip Mrs. Patterson's hand and push when the doctor told her to. It felt like it went on forever, this tearing, overwhelming sensation, but finally, as dawn was breaking over the mountains, she heard the thin, angry wail of a newborn baby. "It is a boy," Dr. Whitmore announced, holding up the tiny, red-faced creature. "A healthy boy." Penelope collapsed back against the pillows, utterly exhausted but overwhelmed with relief and joy. The doctor cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a blanket, then placed him in her arms. The infant was so small, so perfect, with a cap of dark hair and eyes that were trying to focus on her face. "Hello, little one," Penelope whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I am your mother." Elijah appeared in the doorway looking rumpled and anxious. "Is everyone all right?" "Everyone is fine," Mrs. Patterson said, beaming. "Come meet your son." Elijah crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt beside the bed, staring at the baby with an expression of such wonder and love that Penelope felt her heart might burst. He reached out a tentative finger, and the baby wrapped his tiny hand around it, holding on with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Elijah said hoarsely. "You are both perfect." "What should we name him?" Penelope asked softly. Elijah thought for a moment, then smiled. "I think we should call him Emmett Paul, Emmett after my father and Paul because it sounds good with it." "Emmett Paul Barnes," Penelope said, testing the name. "I love it." They spent the rest of the morning in a haze of exhaustion and joy, with Mrs. Patterson fussing over all of them and Dr. Whitmore checking to make sure both mother and baby were truly healthy. Thomas came by to offer his congratulations and stared at the baby with a mixture of awe and terror, as though afraid he might break the fragile creature just by looking at him. When everyone finally left them alone, Elijah climbed carefully into the bed beside Penelope, and they lay together with their son sleeping peacefully between them. "I cannot believe this is real," Elijah said quietly. "A year ago, I was alone in this house, thinking I would probably spend the rest of my life alone. And now I have you and Emmett, and this family I never thought I would have." "We have been very lucky," Penelope agreed. She thought back to that frozen day when she had stepped off the stagecoach, terrified and unprepared, and how Elijah had given her his coat and told her she did not have to pretend with him. He had meant it then, and he had continued to mean it every day since. He had given her not just shelter and security, but honesty and respect and love, and in return, she had given him the same. The winter passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, but Penelope had never been happier. Emmett was a good baby, strong and healthy, and he grew quickly. Elijah was besotted with his son, spending every spare moment holding him and talking to him, and showing him around the ranch as though a 3-month-old could understand what cattle were. Spring came again, bringing new life to the land, and Penelope found herself falling into the rhythm of ranch life with a baby in tow. She would carry Emmett in a sling while she worked in the garden, or set him on a blanket in the shade while she hung laundry. Elijah built a cradle that he kept in the main room so they could always have the baby close by. Thomas proved to be surprisingly good with the baby, overcoming his initial nervousness to become a favorite playmate. He would make funny faces that made Emmett giggle, and as the baby grew older, Thomas would carry him around the barnyard, showing him the animals and talking to him about ranch work. By the time Emmett was a year old, he was walking and starting to say a few words. His first word was "da," which made Elijah glow with pride for days. His second word was "mama," and his third was "horse," which surprised no one given how much time he spent around the animals. The ranch continued to prosper. Elijah had bought the additional land and expanded the herd, and they had hired 2 more hands to help with the increased workload. The house had been enlarged as well, with a proper bedroom for Emmett and a bigger kitchen that made Penelope's work easier. They had become a fixture in the Calistoga community, attending church socials and helping neighbors when help was needed. Penelope had formed close friendships with several of the women in town, and Elijah had earned a reputation as a fair and honest rancher. 2 years after Emmett's birth, Penelope found herself expecting again. This time, the pregnancy was easier because she knew what to expect, and when their daughter was born in the spring of 1889, Penelope was better prepared for the exhaustion and the overwhelming love that came with a newborn. They named her Pearl Margaret, and she was the image of her mother with blonde hair and blue eyes. Emmett was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to hold her and help take care of her. Elijah was just as smitten as he had been with Emmett, marveling at how different Pearl was from her brother, even as a tiny infant. The years rolled by in a steady, satisfying pattern. The ranch grew and prospered, the children grew strong and healthy, and the love between Penelope and Elijah deepened with every passing season. They worked side by side, raised their children together, and built a life that was rich in ways that had nothing to do with money. Emmett grew into a serious, responsible boy who loved working alongside his father with the cattle. Pearl was more adventurous, always climbing trees and exploring the creek that ran through the property. When Emmett was 7 and Pearl was 5, they were joined by another brother whom they named James, and 2 years after that, a second daughter named Rose arrived. The house rang with the sounds of children laughing and playing, and Penelope found herself blessed beyond anything she had ever imagined. She thought sometimes about that terrified young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Calistoga, freezing and alone and unsure of her future. That woman seemed like a stranger now, so different from the confident, capable rancher's wife she had become. One evening, when Emmett was 10 and the other children were tucked into their beds, Penelope and Elijah sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. It was their favorite time of day, this quiet hour when the work was done and they could simply be together. "You remember the day we met?" Penelope asked, leaning her head on Elijah's shoulder. "Of course," Elijah said, wrapping his arm around her. "You were freezing and I gave you my coat." "You told me I did not have to pretend with you," Penelope said softly. "That was when I started to hope that maybe this would work out, that maybe we could build something real together." "We built something better than real," Elijah said. "We built something extraordinary. A family, a home, a life worth living. And it all started because you were brave enough to step off that stagecoach and trust a stranger." "I trusted you because you were trustworthy," Penelope corrected. "You have never let me down, not once in all these years." "And I never will," Elijah promised, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I love you, Penelope Barnes. I will love you until the day I die and probably beyond that." "I love you too," Penelope whispered, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. They sat there as the stars came out. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had chosen each other and kept choosing each other every single day. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night, the soft lowing of cattle, the distant call of an owl, the gentle creak of the barn door swinging in the breeze. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, safe and loved and secure in the knowledge that they belonged to a family that was strong and true. And on the porch, their parents held each other close, grateful for every moment that had led them to this place, this life, this perfect, imperfect, beautiful reality they had created together. As the years continued to pass, the Barnes family became a cornerstone of the Calistoga community. Elijah's reputation as a rancher grew, and he became known as someone whose word could be trusted and whose advice was worth seeking. Penelope became involved in the church ladies' auxiliary and helped establish a small lending library in town, using the love of reading she had shared with Elijah on so many quiet evenings. Emmett grew tall and strong like his father, with the same steady, thoughtful nature. By the time he was 16, he was running much of the ranch operation himself, freeing Elijah to focus on expanding their business interests. Pearl developed a talent for drawing and painting, capturing the beauty of the California landscape in ways that left everyone who saw her work in awe. James was the quiet scholar of the family, always with his nose in a book, dreaming of becoming a teacher. And Rose, the baby, was pure sunshine, spreading joy wherever she went with her infectious laughter and boundless energy. Thomas eventually married a girl from town named Elizabeth, and Elijah helped them build a house on a corner of the ranch property. They had children of their own, and the Barnes children grew up playing with the next generation, creating bonds that would last their entire lives. The turn of the century came and went, ushering in new technologies and new ways of doing things. The ranch adapted and grew with the times, but the essential nature of the life Penelope and Elijah had built remained unchanged. They still worked hard, still valued honesty and kindness, still made time for family and community. When Emmett was 22, he married a school teacher named Anna who reminded Penelope a bit of herself at that age, smart, capable, and brave enough to make a life in a place that could be harsh and unforgiving. The wedding was a grand celebration, with half the county in attendance, and Penelope cried happy tears as she watched her son pledge his life to the woman he loved. Pearl eventually went to San Francisco to study art, but she came home every summer, unable to stay away from the land she loved for too long. James did become a teacher, taking a position at the school in Calistoga and earning a reputation as one of the best educators in the county. And Rose, sweet Rose, married a young rancher from a neighboring property and settled down just a few miles away. As Penelope entered her 50s, She sometimes marveled at the life she had lived. She had gone from poverty and uncertainty to prosperity and deep contentment. She had 4 children who had grown into fine adults, grandchildren who filled her days with joy, and a husband who loved her as much on their 25th anniversary as he had on their wedding day. Elijah's hair had gone gray at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun for decades. But to Penelope, he was just as handsome as the day she had met him. He moved a bit slower now, occasionally complaining about a sore back or stiff knees, but he still worked alongside Emmett every day, still took pride in the ranch they had built together. One winter evening, as they sat by the fire in the home they had shared for so many years, Elijah reached over and took Penelope's hand. "I have been thinking," he said, his voice rougher with age but still steady, "about that day you arrived, how close we came to never meeting at all. What if you had answered a different advertisement? What if I had given up on the idea of finding a wife?" "But I did answer your advertisement," Penelope said gently. "And you did not give up. We found each other, and that is what matters." "You saved my life," Elijah said simply. "I did not realize how lonely I was until you were here, filling this house with light and love and laughter. Everything good in my life came from you, our children, our grandchildren, the happiness I feel every single day. I want you to know that." Penelope felt tears spring to her eyes. Even after all these years, Elijah could still surprise her with his heartfelt declarations. "And you saved mine," she said. "I would have died in that cold, if not physically then certainly spiritually. You gave me a home and a purpose and a love I never dreamed was possible." "We saved each other, Elijah." They sat together in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, the wind whistled around the house, but inside they were warm and safe, surrounded by a lifetime of memories and the certain knowledge of their love. The years continued their steady march. Emmett took over more and more of the ranch operations as Elijah gradually stepped back, content to advise rather than direct. Pearl had her first art show in San Francisco, and the family traveled together to attend, marveling at seeing her beautiful paintings displayed in a real gallery. James published a book about teaching methods that was adopted by schools across California. And Rose had 3 children in quick succession, keeping Penelope busy with visits and childcare and endless knitting projects. When Penelope was 58 and Elijah was 61, they celebrated their 33rd wedding anniversary with a party that seemed to include the entire county. Their children organized the whole thing, transforming the ranch into a fairground with tables laden with food and a small band playing music for dancing. As Penelope looked around at the crowd, at her children and grandchildren, at friends she had known for decades, at the community she had become such an integral part of, she felt a sense of profound gratitude. This was the life she had been meant to live. These were the people she had been meant to love. And it had all started with a single moment of courage when she had stepped off a stagecoach into the freezing California winter and trusted a stranger to give her a chance. Elijah found her standing under an oak tree, watching the festivities, and pulled her into his arms for a dance, even though there was no music playing where they stood. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Barnes," he said, and the love in his eyes was as strong and clear as it had been on their wedding day. "Happy anniversary, Mr. Barnes," Penelope replied, and kissed him softly. They danced there in the shade, 2 people who had weathered every storm together and emerged stronger for it, 2 people who had chosen each other and kept choosing each other through every joy and every challenge. And as they moved together in the dappled sunlight, Penelope knew with absolute certainty that answering that advertisement had been the best decision she had ever made. The years that followed were gentler and slower. Elijah's health began to decline gradually. Nothing serious, but the inevitable wear of a life lived fully and physically. He spent more time in a rocking chair on the porch, watching the ranch he loved continue to thrive under Emmett's capable management. Penelope's own energy waned as well, and she was grateful when Rose or Anna would come by to help with the cooking and cleaning. But even in their advancing age, the love between them remained vibrant and strong. They still held hands when they sat together. They still kissed each other good morning and good night. They still found joy in each other's company, in the shared memories of a lifetime together. One crisp autumn evening, when the leaves were turning gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming winter, Elijah and Penelope sat together on their porch for what would turn out to be one of the last times. Elijah had been feeling poorly for a few days, though he refused to make a fuss about it, and Penelope was hovering close by, watchful and concerned. "Stop worrying," Elijah said, squeezing her hand. "I am fine." "You are not fine," Penelope said, "but I will not argue with you about it tonight." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange and purple. "I have had a good life," Elijah said suddenly. "Better than I ever thought possible, and it is all because of you." "We have had a good life," Penelope corrected. Together, Elijah agreed, and smiled at her with such tenderness that Penelope felt her eyes well up with tears. That night, Elijah died peacefully in his sleep, Penelope's hand clasped in his. The doctor said it was his heart, simply worn out after 68 years of beating. Penelope was devastated by the loss, but she found comfort in knowing that he had died at home, surrounded by the life they had built together, and that his last words to her had been words of love and gratitude. The funeral was attended by what seemed like the entire county. Elijah had touched many lives in his years in Calistoga, and people came from miles away to pay their respects. Emmett gave a eulogy that had everyone in tears, talking about his father's integrity and kindness and unwavering love for his family. In the months that followed, Penelope grieved deeply, but she did not fall apart. She had 4 children who needed her, grandchildren who brought her joy, and a community that rallied around her. She continued to live in the ranch house, unable to imagine living anywhere else, and Emmett moved his family into a newer house on the property so he could be close by. Penelope lived for another 12 years after Elijah's death, staying active and engaged with her family and her community until the very end. She attended more grandchildren's weddings, met great-grandchildren, and watched the ranch continue to grow and prosper under Emmett's leadership. But she never remarried, never even considered it. Elijah had been the love of her life, and she was content to honor his memory and cherish the years they had shared. When Penelope finally passed away at the age of 77, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, her last words were about Elijah. "I see him," she whispered, her eyes focusing on something no one else could see. "He is waiting for me. He still has my coat." And then she was gone, slipping away peacefully to join the man who had given her everything: warmth, safety, love, and a life beyond her wildest dreams. They buried her next to Elijah in the small cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch. The tombstone was simple but elegant, with both their names and the dates of their lives, and underneath, an inscription that Emmett had chosen: "Together always." The ranch remained in the Barnes family for generations, passed down from Emmett to his children and then to his grandchildren. The house was expanded and modernized over the years, but the original structure that Elijah had built with his own hands remained at the heart of it, a testament to his hard work and dedication. The story of how Elijah and Penelope met became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations. The tale of the mail-order bride who arrived freezing in the California winter, and the cowboy who gave her his coat and told her she did not have to pretend, became a touchstone for the family, a reminder of where they came from and what mattered most. Descendants would visit the cemetery on the hill and stand before the graves of their ancestors, marveling at the courage it must have taken for Penelope to travel across the country to marry a stranger, and the kindness it must have taken for Elijah to welcome her with such generosity and respect. They would think about how one moment of bravery and one moment of compassion had created ripples that extended through time, creating families and communities and legacies that would endure for generations. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun was setting over the mountains and the wind whispered through the grass, people claimed they could see two figures standing on the porch of the old ranch house, holding hands and watching over the land they had loved so dearly. Whether it was truly the spirits of Elijah and Penelope, or just a trick of the light and shadow, no one could say for certain. But those who believed in the power of love that transcends even death liked to think that they were still there, still together, still choosing each other across the vast expanse of eternity, because some love stories do not end with death. Some love stories are so strong, so true, so deeply rooted in honesty and respect and genuine affection that they become eternal. And the love story of Elijah Barnes and Penelope Bradford Barnes was exactly that kind of story, a testament to the power of taking a chance, of being brave enough to trust, of giving someone your coat when they are cold and telling them they do not have to pretend, that they can simply be themselves, and that will be enough. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything,